And Franco, we heard a lot of this through the pandemic, that all of the spending they were doing was necessary, that the government, quote unquote, had our backs. Is it true that they had to spend what they did through the pandemic?
What the Fed should have done is prioritize spending to address the problem, not spend buckets of cash on everything. So since the beginning of COVID-19, nearly $200 billion in new spending that has been announced isn't for the pandemic or isn't dealing with the pandemic. Now, when you have a leaky roof, you fix a leaky roof. I think Canadians understand that, but you don't go rack up credit card bills buying a new flat screen, a couple ATVs, and maybe a brand new BMW. Remember, the feds were spending all-time highs even before the pandemic. So the government's politicians should have been able to find savings in other areas of the budget. But the government didn't do that. It spent money like crazy, and now we're dealing with inflation that is nearly 4 decades high.
But now governments are kind of pivoting their argument, saying, well, we have to fight off a pending recession. We have to spend money, and frankly, turning off the taps, so to speak, before a recession would be bad economic policy. So Franco, how would you respond to that statement? And what would you suggest as an alternative to stimulate the economy?
It's crazy spending for years, the massive debt, and using the money printer to finance the government's deficits. That's really making these tough times harder. That's creating the inflation, and that it's making it more expensive for so many Canadians to afford gasoline or ground beef. Now, remember, the government doesn't create wealth. At best, the government redistributes money away from taxpayers. And this government is taking way too much from taxpayers. We saw during the pandemic the carbon tax go up 3 times. Payroll taxes have been hiked 3 times. And if all that drives you to drink, just remember that every time you go pick up that 2-4 of Keith's or try to enjoy the bottle of Pinot with your better half, well, the federal government has raised taxes there too. So what should Ottawa do? Well, Ottawa should follow the lead of 51 other countries and cut taxes.
So my last question for the moment is, Franco, when do you think the government could reasonably balance the budget? And how could they do that? What would they have to cut?
Well, we found that the federal government could balance the budget within 2 years just by bringing in spending back to pre-pandemic highs, which were already all-time highs. So that means that before the pandemic in 2018, the Trudeau government was spending more money than the feds did during any single year of World War II. So with overspending like that, finding savings in every area of the federal budget should be like finding water in the ocean. But unfortunately, this government seems like it just wants to spend more money on everything forever. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's own data shows that under the current trajectory of the government, we won't see a balanced budget until 2041. Now, 2 decades of deficits are bad enough, but it gets worse because the feds won't balance the budget if interest rates don't stay relatively low, if the economy doesn't experience steady growth every single year until 2041, and if politicians don't say no to new spending. And even if the feds eventually balance the budget in 2041, taxpayers will still have to pay about $800 billion by then just to cover interest charges on the government credit card. So $800 billion in interest charges in total will be the cost once the budget is finally balanced in 2041 under the status quo. Now, that's a cost of $18,000 for every Canadian, and that's hundreds of billions of dollars that can't be used to improve healthcare or to lower taxes, because that money would have to go to the bond fund managers on Bay Street just to cover interest on the government's credit